Aki, my son, you must preserve these books with body and soul. They contain the history of our whole folk, as well as our ancestors. These are the opening lines of the Oera book, one of the most intriguing and potentially explosive and significant documents brought to light in modern times. This work we're about to discuss is controversial, and its legitimacy is still very much a raging debate. It's aggressively rejected by most academics, and though this rejection seems largely driven by all the wrong motives and is often so strange and frenzied in character as to be a bit suspect, I don't want this video to be viewed as a definitive embrace of the work's historical authenticity. To me, this is still an open question, and a leading reason I've created this video. My hope is to help launch several independent research journeys, to help us more swiftly come to some reliable, well-reasoned, hard and fast conclusions. I will say this much: ever since my first read of the translated manuscript, it's stuck with me in an unprecedented way. The essence of the work brought to mind other most ancient works in the Aryan tradition, such as the Avesta, the Vedas, and the Nordic sagas. Its content seems to draw from a well of depth and timeless wisdom in a manner difficult to describe, other than to say this: much of my own life has been spent considering various manners of thinking and living, both as individuals or communities, that might lead to lasting health, harmony, vitality, that might allow peoples or nations a robust framework on which to build, ensuring they're always reaching greater heights, as opposed to falling backward, according to the most meaningful metrics. This philosophy and worldview this book speaks to echoes my thoughts on these fronts practically as mirror image at times. What's more, it seems to hit upon what I've long considered to be the healthy, ideal archetype of Western mankind. Speaks to those core traits and characteristics that seem to make them unique. Every people has these: strengths, weaknesses, differentiating attributes or manners of viewing the world. And this work seems to more eloquently touch upon our own, at least what I believe them to be, based on all I've been able to gather, to a degree equal to anything else I've ever read. It's written in a style and script nearly as intriguing as its contents, so much so that an entire video might easily be created on this subject alone. And some have claimed this script might be one of the most ancient, root-written languages in the Indo-European family, acting as influence and inspiration to many other languages. It makes use of a six-spoked wheel to formulate each written character, characters which are for the most part familiar and readable by many speakers of Indo-European languages even today. One of the many reasons this document is so explosive, if legitimate, is that it speaks to events stretching back to 2000 BC, providing the history of a race, tribe, or nation periodically and sporadically across several millennia. According to OLB chronology, the first part of the book was largely compiled by copying short history fragments preserved in writing on the walls of burgs and citadels, circa 600 BC or so, and was then added to periodically, over time, as the document was passed down through a family line. The people group it speaks to, and those it's claimed are responsible for its authoring, are called the Fryan people, after their progenitor, Freya. It speaks to a culture that prizes virtue, character, honesty and justice, and especially self-discipline, vastly higher than material gain. Their belief system is simple and straightforwardly monotheistic, in the manner similar to that of the royal Scythians as described by Herodotus, or the ancient Germans as described by Tacitus. And speaking personally for a moment, in their description of God and their spiritual beliefs, I can't help but hear echoes of Jesus' words, echoes of the Buddha, of the Bhagavad Gita and Rig Veda, and the Avestas, and a very, very strong aversion to corruption of this core message, to priests who might seek to use spiritual practice as a control mechanism to corrupt ends. Quote, "It comes from the east, out of the bosom of the priests. It will breed so much mischief that Eartha will not be able to drink the blood of her slain children. It will spread darkness over the minds of men, like storm clouds over the sunlight. Everywhere craft and deception shall contend with freedom and justice. For our beloved ancestors' sake, and for the sake of our precious freedom, 1,000 times I beg you, dearest, to never let the eyes of a monk go over these writings. They speak sweet words, but unnoticed they meddle with all that concerns us friars. They collaborate with foreign kings who pay them well. They know that we are their greatest enemies because we dare speak about freedom, justice, and royal obligations. Therefore, they want to obliterate all traces of our ancestral heritage and what is left of our morals. My dear ones, I have visited their palace. If Ralda allows it, and if we do not strengthen ourselves, they will exterminate us all." End quote. Ralda is the title they use for the divine, the creator and singular force behind all things. They speak of him also as the All-Father, or All-Feeder, that from which everything springs or flows. To quote directly from the notes of the original translator of the OLB, Jan Atema, quote, "Balmer's Dictionary of Mythology, Allfather, the supreme god of Nordic antiquity, and proof that the peoples inhabiting Sweden, Norway, and half of Germany had recognized the purest worship of God as the basis of their religion. For in him we find back all noble qualities which the Mosaic tradition attached to the unspeakable, and the Christian religion to the only God, without any of the features distorting the sublime image of God, such as human passions, anger, vengeance, zeal, and jealousy. He is the creator, commander, and navigator of the universe. His breath blows through all times. His greatness and his power are unexplainable, and no one can imagine him. For he has never shown himself to a mortal, and when his spirit, his breath, dwells on earth, it is in the shadows of mysterious groves, in quiet, sacred forests dedicated to him." End quote. And to quote the Oera text directly, quote, "Ralda is the most ancient or primordial, over oldest, for he created all things. Ralda is all in all, for he is eternal and everlasting. Ralda is omnipresent, yet invisible. Therefore, the being is called Spirit. All that we can see of him are the created beings that come and go again through his life, because from Ralda all things proceed, and to him they return. Out of Ralda both the beginning and the end come. All things merge into him. Ralda is the only almighty being, because all other power is borrowed from him and returns to him. From Ralda all forces are derived, and all forces return to him again. Therefore he alone is the creative being, and nothing is created outside of him." End quote. Ralda established eternal principles, or Aiwa, in all that was created, and regulations can only be good if they are founded upon these principles. Although all is part of Ralda, the malice of the people is not of him. Malice comes from laziness, carelessness, and stupidity. Therefore it can harm the people, but never Ralda. With the wheel turning, all creation alters and changes, but only God is unalterable. Since Ralda is God, he cannot change, and since he endures, only he is being, and everything else emergence. Whereas his life is continually progressing, however, nothing can remain stationary. Therefore all creatures change their position and their shape, as well as their minds. Therefore can neither earth itself nor any creature ever say I am, but rather I was. Likewise no man can ever say I think, but merely I thought. Aiwa refers to the rules that are imprinted equally in the hearts of all people, in order that they may know what is right and what is wrong, and by which they are able to judge their own deeds and those of others. That is, insofar as they have been brought up well and are not corrupted. There is also yet another meaning attached. Aiwa also relates to Ae-like, that is, water-like, even and smooth, like water that is not disturbed by windstorm or anything else. If water is disturbed, it becomes uneven, unright. but it always has a tendency to become even again. That is its nature, just as the inclination towards justice and freedom exists in Freya's children. We derive this disposition from our feeder, Ralda's spirit, which speaks strongly in Freya's children, and will eternally remain so." End quote. And this work doesn't merely echo the spiritual or philosophical wisdom of the ages, but mentions and provides context regarding a great many major events and influential historical figures, to such an extent, in fact, that detractors have called it too good to be true, or a bit too perfect and comprehensive. Jesus seems to be mentioned, as is Woden and Alexander the Great. An entire section pertaining to laws and regulations is authored by the famed Minos, who Thucydides claimed was the most ancient man known to build a navy, and whose constitution formed the basis for that of Lycurgus in Sparta. Athena and Minerva are mentioned, along with a few pivotal events in India and Greece, and a strong connection to Hellenic Greece is inferred. Even the split between the Celtic element and the rest of the Germanic peoples seems alluded to. In short, if the work someday proves a reliable record, it will fundamentally reshape our understanding of our past. Other writers and content creators have touched upon this work previously, and I don't believe they've done it justice. I certainly won't do it justice either, and it's only due to making this clear at the outset that I feel free to even attempt to tackle this topic. Up until now, in the Subverted History series, we've covered fairly tame ground, and that I've not taken many speculative leaps or engaged in a great deal of educated guesswork. But in this video, and in the next, I'll be tossing a couple of hand grenades, figuratively speaking, as a means of igniting debate and discussion, and hopefully encouraging some diligent and careful research to help bring us closer to embracing or rejecting some leading theories. So prepare yourselves, it'll definitely get interesting. My hope is that you'll be open-minded, yet discerning, and skeptical in the most genuine and healthy sense of that word. Any worthwhile truth should undergo a trial by fire, because whatever makes it out the other side is the stronger for it. Even in the worst-case scenario, if the text in the OLB hasn't been handed down through countless generations, as is claimed, you'll be exposed to a work of timeless wisdom and profound life lessons, acting as a springboard for me to engage in some in-depth discussion on the larger history of Western mankind. In the best-case scenario, you're about to be exposed to one of the most important, least-known historical works in the world, with the potential to help rewrite some of the most key portions of human history as we know it. Enough preface, let's begin. The Oera came to light in 1867 when a man named Cornelis over de Linden handed it over to a librarian in Friesland, Netherlands. He stated it had come into his possession through his grandfather, who in turn had received it from an aunt, and it had been passed down through the family line for many generations. It was first passed to one Elko Federvesh, a scholar who subsequently studied the document and confirmed its authenticity. Somewhat strangely, he later withdrew this conclusion, some say to save his career. The document then enters the hands of Jan Atema, a prominent member of the Frisian Society for History and Culture, and the man who was to become the first translator and publisher of the Oera Bok in 1872. To help give some idea of the importance of this work, Atema stated, quote, "We may thus accept that we possess in this manuscript, of which the first part was composed in the 6th century before our era, the oldest production, after Homer and Hesiod, of European literature. And here we find in our fatherland a very ancient people in possession of development, civilization, industry, navigation, commerce, literature, and pure elevated ideas of religion, whose existence we had never even conjectured." End quote. The work created an immediate firestorm of controversy and debate, and equally passionate defenders and detractors, in an age in which Europe was seeking to better understand its roots and clarify its own historical journey. In 1922, the Dutch-German historian and scholar of ancient religions and symbols, Herman Wirth, published Die Irrlinde Chronik in German. In fact, a discussion of the work was said to be a leading impetus for the creation of the German Ahnenerbe in 1935, intended to function as a, quote, society for the study of the history of primeval ideas, essentially an elite research institution, a gathering together of some of the best scholars of the day from a wide range of academic fields, focused on piecing together the historical picture, with special focus, of course, on the role played by the Germanic peoples. The energetic debate on the authenticity of the work continued throughout the period of National Socialism in Germany, with Himmler himself eventually becoming one of its most spirited defenders. And this, no doubt, is a leading reason the work has received such unjust and one-sided treatment post-World War II. The original manuscript uses what are now called phonetic characters. These phonetic characters are selected from a circle, the sun sign, with a vertical I and X crossing it, giving, surprisingly, a character set or context in which most letters of the alphabet and numbers are easily recognized by modern Europeans and Americans. They were recorded by Guido, surnamed over die Linde, in the year 1256 AD. He copied his originals onto the new Arabic paper, very desirable in Europe at the time, which was made from basic Egyptian cotton without watermark. He called it foreign paper and used a carbon ink without iron. This was fortunate because the more popular iron-based inks were used at a later date and are easily recognizable by their discoloration, giving us one more piece of evidence to support the book's authenticity. And finally, before we go into the work itself, I'd like to go over the reasons why I've long felt a work like this could possibly, or even should possibly, exist, and thus why this work so profoundly struck me, even beyond the wisdom and deeper lessons conveyed. Looking back through the broad sweep of history, using the full context picture provided by those oldest histories that still survive to this day, I'm always struck by the interconnectedness of key populations and cultures in remote antiquity. Beginning somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 BC especially, signs of deeply interconnected peoples begin to spring up everywhere, from the Tarim Basin to India and Persia, to Sumer, Egypt and Crete, to the Caucasus and the steppes, with traces found as far away as North and South America, China, Japan, and the Koreas. The written description of these people, as well as the artistic depictions and statues and the most ancient remains recently exhumed, illustrate clearly that these were kin, closely related to one another. Not the entire populations of these regions, in many cases, but at least, in most cases, the ruling and governing caste. So, these don't seem to be the distinct and disconnected elements with little to no connection to one another, as many post-World War II historians have begun to argue, but very much the opposite. I've come to believe this might be best explained by envisioning a family tree, branching off into ever greater complexity. At each new branching, a, quote, new people is born. Yet this newness and differentiation was often only culture deep. In a racial sense, these remained brother and cousin peoples, and this understanding was likely retained in most cases, at least for some number of generations past, and then slowly but surely, time and forgetfulness performed their inevitable functions. Previously, I've discussed a group I consider to be something of a seed or father people, which eventually broke off into countless branches, stretching across vast expanses, in the videos on the Scythian and Gothic history. This allowed us to cover the Black Sea region and steppe territory, largely landlocked, horse and wagon-related peoples, moving into Europe through Poland and Ukraine until they eventually blended in with brother peoples to help establish the Europe we know today. But who were these brother peoples, perhaps existing in Europe before Jordanus claims the Goths departed, and existing still when they returned? And what of them? There exists an immense amount of evidence of an impressively competent seafaring population that explored, mined, and even settled far and wide. If true, the book we'll be discussing in this video speaks well to this missing puzzle piece. One of the most difficult aspects of piecing together our true history a problem encountered by every historian that's made the attempt over the past millennia, is that tendency of the Aryan or Germanic peoples to pass the bulk of their most important knowledge down via oral transmission, thereby allowing skilled bards to give the words life and spirit, depth and meaning, something one simply can't get from coldly clinical marks scrawled on a flat surface. History, to be worth anything, must be alive with spirit, and in fact its leading purpose as an art is to transfuse this spirit and energy across time and space. This modern conception of the memorization of lifeless facts and figures would have been a very foreign one to their mentality, and likely one they'd have been confused by and deemed deeply unhealthy. Of course, this lack of written history creates a problem for us as their descendants, having long since lost our bards and even our very recognition of the invaluable service they provided. I've mentioned before, and I'd like to reiterate, I can't ascribe to that general narrative regarding the ancestors of modern-day Europeans always living on this same patch of land, and more effectively phrased, only living on this same patch of land. The number of historical accounts that contradict this idea is massive and still growing, as even today we occasionally uncover writings, carvings, or other related proofs. For decades, academics have made something of a sport of aggressively mocking Irish legends connected to Egypt, and subsequent red-headed Egyptian pharaohs discovered with a far stronger genetic connection to northwestern Europe than to present-day Egyptians, or Scottish accounts of their ties with the Scythians, or Spanish and German accounts of Gothic ancestry, and the numerous histories of Goths roaming back into Europe from the Black Sea region. The Franks have the Avesta Francorum, and the Brits have Geoffrey of Monmouth, and the Romans have Virgil, and their Brutus and Aeneas as progenitors and founding elements of their respective nations, directly alluding to ties to the Trojans, and referring to a displacement of peoples after the fall of Troy. Egypt, India, and Persia, extending all the way into the Tarim Basin and beyond, are replete with stories of different races of peoples, and very clearly speak of a group they describe as taller in stature, very often reported to have fair hair and eyes, and have left numerous visual examples behind to attest to this type. The Tarim Basin mummies still had preserved tartan pattern clothing, of the style very similar to that found in modern Scotland, and many of these fair-haired remains were as tall as 6.5 feet. When you approach any of these individual cases as a niche historical specialist, especially with a prejudicial mind, it's not impossible to craft a story as to why these accounts might somehow appear untruthful, and laugh and mock them out of the public eye. But anyone approaching the topic a bit more like a detective, that is to say, taking into account the full context picture, especially in an interdisciplinary manner, can't possibly continue to mock such ideas. And those that choose the route of such mockery do so from extremely shaky ground, from an equally shaky premise. The conventional academic historical perspective has proved absurdly inaccurate time and time again, a truth best exemplified by the need to rewrite human history each and every time a Göbekli Tepe is discovered, for example. And the root of this inaccuracy seems to be their unwillingness to see unity and commonality in peoples across space and time, or the potential for a civilization capable of traveling vast distances, and spreading or imparting knowledge, symbols, belief systems. So let's play this theory forward a bit. It's my opinion that much of our historical confusion seems to spring from the fact that as this family tree of peoples split off and spread throughout the world, they often became known by several different names, even a single branch sometimes being referred to by several names simultaneously. A bit like how a modern German might be called Deutsch, Allemagne, even Saksa or Saksama by the Finnish and Estonians, and modern Germanic peoples are known under a still larger number of different labels. And recall that the Scythians that moved into India were most often called the Sakai. Many historians have used the term Aryan and Scythian interchangeably, or Scythian and Goth, or Goth and Saxon, or Saxon and Frisian, or Frisian and Jute, or Jutes and Danes. One could go on and on here. In fact, in a historical account of Alfred the Great by Asher, he speaks of King Alfred's mother being descended from Goths and Jutes, and practically identifies them as being one race. It's also intriguing, and perhaps not entirely unrelated, that Herodotus speaks of Hyperborea in the same breath as Scythia. Might it be that similar overlap and conflation of peoples existed in more ancient times? I think the answer here is almost certainly yes, and likely to an even greater degree than today. Ashoka, the emperor of the Maurya dynasty in India around 250 BC, is a good example here. His grandmother, a Greek princess, his pillars of Greek design, and he seems to have a very strong connection to Persia in a number of ways. Heracles is another, a figure claimed by several Indo-Europeans as their progenitor or heroic figure. Scholars that have studied both the Avesta and the Rig Veda, two of the oldest and most foundational documents in the Aryan tradition from India and Persia, have noted the immense overlap and correlation and similarity. Similar lowercase g gods, similar references to horses and chariots and horse sacrifice, or their caste systems, or soma. The term Aryan certainly seems to be a tie that binds, acting as some connective tissue across time and space. But scholars seem to be confused and conflicted, especially since World War II, about this word. Some adamantly claim that it refers to only peoples hailing from ancient Iran. Others, equally adamantly, claim it references only those from India. Some claim it meant noble, exalted, and other positive attributes, and was only a descriptor of cultivated traits and tendencies. Others claim it obviously referred to a people group. I tend to think it may well have been a reference to all of the above. An exceptional people and culture who formed the elite and ruling caste of the vast majority of the region, from which many great sages and leaders happened to spring, and who then proceeded to spread far and wide across significant stretches of time. And in a related point, scholars often like to speak of peoples like the Scythians or Kushans, or similarly sprawling and ill-defined peoples and cultures, including the Goths and Germanic elements later on, as if they exclusively picked up notions, technological developments, artistic styles, and customs and traditions from large numbers of neighboring nations. And this may well be true in some sense, but I'm curious as to why the possibility is never entertained that they instead put down such notions, artistic styles, technological developments, customs, and traditions. Many seem to take it as a given that they borrowed, as opposed to their being part of a singular widespread culture operating above and across what we today conceive as national boundaries, and being more racial and genetic in character than merely region or location bound. This is vital to bear in mind. As nearly every first-hand account makes so abundantly clear, historical peoples almost always saw themselves as a race, tribe, or extended family with kinship ties, whereas modern academics will attempt to use any other classification method they're able to dream up, be it burial customs, pottery, created or traded goods, language, and perform any amount of mental gymnastics necessary to avoid classifying and viewing these peoples as they seem to have classified and viewed themselves. To use an extreme example to illustrate the point, consider just how muddy the historical picture might become if in some future date, let's say after some massive natural disaster, historians and archaeologists sifting through the remains of South Africa noticed similar man-made goods, similar building styles, and burial traditions, and thus took the initiative to place both Dutch Afrikaners and Black Africans under a single people group label. And this label was then used as the foundation for further classification around the world, causing future discoveries of both Dutch or African populations uncovered anywhere else to potentially be labeled as part of a South African nation or diaspora. This would set us back tremendously, as it wouldn't be reflective of the reality of the situation in the least. Black Africans don't consider themselves the same as Dutch Afrikaners, and vice versa, even if they may both drink the same sodas, or use similar dishes, or bury their loved ones in a similar fashion. In short, if we hope to piece together a reliable understanding of history, we have to understand and make use of the same lineage and ancestry-based framework and perspective through which they viewed their own world. And also recognize that not only are the populations living in these regions today in many cases poorly representative of those who lived and ruled there long ago, but that our modern border demarcations and names and labels for nations and cultures so often bear little to no resemblance whatsoever to those in common usage long ago. Cultivating a sensible historical picture is an art and needs to be treated as such. In the Oera, we have a work which speaks of a people for whom sea travel was second nature, to whom modern national boundaries were meaningless. Their progenitor, Freya, is mentioned in the Persian Avesta as the personification of love. The OLB speaks to adventures and settlements in Greece and India, touches upon a genetic connection to an Egyptian leader, military operations with Alexander the Great and his Macedonians. I've long felt this propensity to travel and explore, coupled with what seems to be a custom of periodically sending off their most energetic elements of excess population, is likely why the genetic and historical picture is so difficult for modern academics to unravel and make sense of. It seems these people went nearly everywhere. As we now know, the languages spoken by these supposedly distinct peoples are deeply intertwined and interconnected. William Jones, exceptional scholar and philologist of the late 1700s, was so struck by the similarities between Greek, Sanskrit, and Latin that he stated, quote, "A stronger affinity than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong, indeed, that no philologer could examine all three of them without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists." End quote. And with these words, just 2 short centuries ago, the concept of a lost mother tongue laying at the foundation of all Indo-European languages was spoken into being. The linguistic dimension of the historical puzzle is hugely important. And it's interesting to note that languages like Lithuanian and the Dutch, Phrygian, Saxon, Germanic root tongue appears to be even more similar to Proto-Indo-European than Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. Some language experts now claim that Gothic and Old Prussian may even be the most similar of all. And it was less than 2 centuries ago the German linguist Friedrich Max Müller found what he believed to be evidence of an ancient invasion of India by the Arya. New Zealand polymath Edward Trieger further argued that an Aryan tidal wave had washed over India and continued to push south, through the islands of the East Indian archipelago, reaching the distant shores of New Zealand. Scholars such as John Batchelor, Armand de Quatrefages, and Daniel Brinton extended this invasion theory to the Philippines, Hawaii, and Japan, identifying indigenous peoples who they believed were the descendants of early Aryan conquerors. Recently, the Oseberg Buddha was discovered in Helgö, Sweden. The standard procedure in such cases is for academics to presume trade brought the figure to the area from far off. But in this case, the artifact has been proven to have been created nearby, possibly Ireland or England. We've discussed in the past how Gautama Buddha was always described as fair-skinned with blue eyes, indicating an Arya lineage. And this Gautama seems to be etymologically connected to the Gaut or Gautas of Gothic tradition, a figure still listed in many Anglo-Saxon royal genealogies, representing an ancestor or national god in their origin stories. This isn't to say that they were the same person, but rather that the name or title seems to spring from the same language and tradition. I mention these examples to partially outline just how little we know, and how much of this picture is still to be properly uncovered, communicated, and understood. And unfortunately, we've entered a sensitivity-obsessed era in which honest and effective research on these topics is essentially impossible. And again, I'd like to reiterate the point that I think we need to be very careful to remember that just because 2 different labels or names are used for 2 historical peoples, this certainly doesn't definitively prove that it's not essentially one singular people and culture being referenced. To properly determine this, one needs to analyze a full spectrum of attributes. The language spoken, if evidence is available, the cultural customs and traditions, the style of art or pottery or goods, the style of ship or military equipment used, among other factors. When we notice exceptional similarities between two peoples across several of these categories, chances are very good, in my experience, that there's an equally strong genetic connection, and that any myths or stories or historical accounts connecting the two peoples deserve to be taken more seriously. This makes perfect sense, of course, as shifts in a way of life can alter any one of these specific attributes fairly significantly, but almost never a complete shift across all or even most of these categories. In other words, large groups of homogeneous peoples don't change in fundamental ways from top to bottom in any short period of time. I can't help but see an immense overlap in the tone of the Oera book and that of the Nordic sagas, or the accounts and stories of the ancient Scythians, or the Goths, or the Germanic peoples more generally, to the extent that, if proven legitimate, this work may lie nearer to the center of a long-standing cultural tradition than virtually any other I'm aware of. There's even a chance that this is why the work is seen as such a threat by some, especially post-World War II, and with an academic environment dominated by individuals that seem keen on playing favorites in the spirit of the age, and aggressively rewriting history accordingly. Yet just because an absurdly dishonest and partisan academia so rejects the work with a uniquely passionate hostility certainly doesn't make it legitimate, and it's obvious why they would mount such frenzied attacks. Not only is it a bit jarring relative to conventional historical understanding, but the book speaks very frankly on matters of race, in a manner many might be horrified by in the current atmosphere, describing the three mothers of all mankind as something akin to racial archetypes, going on to list perceived strengths and weaknesses accordingly, and repeatedly stressing the need to avoid indiscriminate intermixture, resulting in destruction or dilution of these types. This is balanced with a magnanimous kindness and an extremely impressive sense of natural justice and fairness with regard to outsiders, especially those in need. Yet this kindness is always coupled with the conception of vigilance, wariness, and prudence, and the idea of a people eager to help, but at arm's length, to ensure their own sense of morals and ethics might always survive. This is a constant refrain. Retaining their proper orientation and healthy way of life is emphasized time and time again, and yet they believe themselves uniquely gifted in this one sense, as if this sense of justice and harmony sprang from the inside out. A tradition of, quote, Berg maidens is mentioned, specially chosen women similar to Vestal virgins, or even the oracle in Greek tradition. While the supreme being is referenced as male, the earthly mother is, of course, female, in the traditional sky father, earth mother conception that remains constant across most ancient beliefs and myths. This has caused some to speculate that this was a matriarchal society, but I'm not sure I agree with this. Especially in times of serene peace, in this homogeneous society that focused so heavily on peace, harmony, and true justice, this national mother figure seems to act as a manager of the household in service of Ralda, inward-looking, balancing, and peacekeeping, while the more proactive masculine element is the creative and manifesting force that strikes outward from this home base. Tacitus and other writers remark more than once on just how much both the ancient Germans and Scythians prized the counsel and intuitive judgment of their best-oriented women, specifically virgins set aside for this role, those isolated from the more petty and negative and draining events of daily life. And to interject some subjective speculation for a moment, this makes some sense to me. In times of peace and harmony, if peace and harmony is the goal, and if jackals aren't breaking down the gates as a constant subversive threat, perhaps the most innocent and untarnished mind and mindset provided for the calmest water, with regard to keeping the house in good order, maintaining high standards in this regard, and keeping friction to a minimum. The conception of virgin Berg maidens, some of whom chose to step down from their role in order to marry, also strikes me as a means for a people to be much more certain of the lineage of their leadership, all but eliminating the possibility of a promiscuous queen or princess becoming pregnant as a result of a secretive affair or courtly intrigue. However, when times become much more difficult or contentious, as is seen in the OLB itself with the rise of their first officially recorded king on European soil, Frizzo. When serious threats begin to appear and waters grow choppy and chaotic, it seems a shift in structure was seen as necessary, and the influence then shifted entirely to the masculine end of the spectrum, to begin to err on the side of hardness and strength. And speaking of water, I'd be remiss if we didn't speak to the oldest account recorded in the work, which claims to stretch all the way back to 2190 BC, and speaks of an immense flood throwing a once peaceful world into complete disarray. Many other histories, like those of Sumer, for example, stretch back to this period and beyond, and nearly all speak of floods. But academics have tended to treat them all as fictional, or allegory, or otherwise dismiss them. And few have been as clear and direct and detailed as this account handed down in the OLB. Quote, "How Aldland sank, 2190 BCE, how the bad times came. During the whole summer, sun had hidden behind the clouds, as if she did not want to see earth. Wind rested in his bags, causing smoke and steam to stand like pillars over the houses and pools. This made the air become dreary and dull, and neither joy nor pleasure were in the hearts of people. In the midst of this stillness, earth began to tremble, as if she was dying. Mountains split open to spew out fire and flames. Many others sank into her bowels, and where there had been plains before, mountains rose up. Aldland, or Atland, as the steersmen say, sank down, and the foaming waves tread over mountain and valley in such a way that everything was submerged. Many people were buried alive, and many who had escaped the fire later perished in the water. Not only in the lands of Finda did mountains spew fire, but also in Twiskland. As a result, forests burned one after the other, and when wind came from there, our lands were covered with ashes. Rivers changed their course, and at their mouths new islands were formed of sand and drowned animals. Earth suffered like this for 3 years, but when she recovered, one could see her wounds. Many lands were submerged, others had risen out of the sea, and half of the Twiskland had been deforested. Bands of Finda's folk came roaming across the empty spaces, and our dispersed people were exterminated or became their allies. This forced us to be twice as vigilant, and time taught us that unity is our strongest burg." End quote. This calls to mind Plato and his work Timaeus, in which Solon has a discussion with a priest residing in Egypt. Many modern editions of this work are replete with hour-long dogmatic introductions intended to debunk the ideas expressed. But it's important to remember that Plato himself said the following, quote, "This tale about Atlantis, though strange, is certainly true, having been attested by Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages." End quote. A snippet of the tale is as follows. Quote, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are but children. There is no old doctrine handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you the reason behind this. There have been and will be again many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes, the greatest having been brought about by earth fire and inundation. Whatever happened either in your country or ours, or in any other country of which we are informed, any action which is noble and great, or in any other way remarkable which has taken place, all that has been inscribed long ago in our temple records, whereas you and other nations did not keep imperishable records. And then, after a period of time, the usual inundation visits like a pestilence, and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And thus you have to begin over again as children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves. As for those genealogies of yours which you have related to us, they are no better than the tales of children. For in the first place you remember one deluge only, whereas there were a number of them. And in the next place there dwelt in your land, which you do not know, the fairest and noblest race of men that ever lived, of which you are but a seed or remnant. And this was not known to you, because for many generations the survivors of that destruction made no records." End quote. Atlantis itself is far too tricky and sprawling a topic to get into in this video, but I can state this with confidence. I do believe we know very little about our true history as yet, especially stretching back beyond the birth of Christ, and even more so beyond 2 or 3,000 BC. It seems a significant cause of this is likely some mixture of immense natural disasters, followed by lost or intentionally ignored truthful accounts, and perhaps even aggressively pushed untruthful, derivative and speculative accounts. I've seen enough to be relatively certain of this much. Shame and mockery and the resulting reputation considerations has chased more people away from a deep dive into these topics than definitive and provable truths or fact pictures have. And this certainly isn't how the sciences should function. And it's interesting to me just how much of what Plato says about these ancients, about his ideal form of living, seems to match so closely with the Royal Scythian or Gothic or Phrygian culture, and that of the Germans observed by Tacitus. Montaigne tells us, quote, Plato, in his Laws, considers no plague in the world more harmful to a city than this, to let the young change at will from one fashion to another, in dress, gestures, dances, exercises, and songs, shifting their judgment now to this position, now to that, running after novelties and honoring their inventors, whereby morals are corrupted and all ancient institutions come into disdain and contempt. In all things except those that are simply bad, change is to be feared. Change of seasons, winds, food, and humors. And no laws are held in their true honor except those to which God has given some ancient duration, so that no one knows their origin or that they were ever different. End quote. I think it's significant that the term plague is used here. The prescience and prophetic nature of the wisdom expressed by these ancient sages is remarkable. And this wisdom is seemingly made manifest by these more ancient cultures. The Phrygians of the OLB speak to these ravages caused by plagues, caused by lax trade and migration policy, and a reduced discipline and vigilance, allowing sickness to creep in undetected. But they seem even more on guard against spiritual or cultural plagues. Their first and foremost concern wasn't forcing others to adopt their viewpoints or way of life, but rather maintaining their own high standards in these regards, at all costs. The OLB tells a story of the Phrygian people dealing with a hostile neighboring element with deceptive and subversive intent, to the extent that they'd taken to luring away, even kidnapping, Phrygian children, the most attractive or charismatic of which then often return as walking advertisements for this foreign element, whose corrupt leaders are referred to as the Magus, essentially enslaved by them, and with a mission to spread their doctrine. Then the OLB tells us, quote, when these slave people had learned our language, they convinced the military leaders and nobles to submit to the Magus, so their sons could succeed them without election by the folk. Those who had gained a front yard for their house for their good deeds were promised a backyard on behalf of the Magus. Whoever had earned a front and backyard already was promised a surrounding yard, and who had a surrounding yard, a whole estate. If the nobles were still loyal Phrygians, the slave people changed course and aimed at the more degenerate sons. Yesterday, some of you suggested that we mobilize to force the eastern states back to the old customs, but in my humble opinion, that would fail miserably. Imagine if our cattle had been plagued by a serious lung disease, which was still raging badly there. Would you then risk mixing your healthy animals with their sick ones? Surely not. As we all must agree and confirm that this would turn into a disaster, who then would be so reckless as to dare send his children into the midst of an utterly depraved folk? End quote. This is a constant refrain throughout. These were a people with high walls, metaphorically, who sought to lead or inspire by example, not force, very much contrary to the ambitious proponents of slavery in the broadest sense of that word, that seemed to be a constant threat and thorn in their sides. There's a specific back-and-forth dialogue between a burg maiden, purported to be Helena, whose given name was actually Minerva, and a group of corrupt priests, reminiscent of the Pharisees, that well illustrates this. Quote, when nigh Helena, or Helena, whose own name was Minerva, was well established, and the Greeks loved her almost as much as her own folk, some princes and priests came to the burg and asked her where her inherited states, or Urva, were. Helena answered, I carry men, that is, my Erva, in my heart. What I inherited is love of wisdom, justice, and freedom. If I lost that, I would be like the lowest of your slaves. Now I give advice for free, but then I would sell it. The dignitaries left and shouted mockingly, "We are your obedient servants, wise Helena." But they failed in their ridicule, for the folk that loved and followed her took this name as a name of honor. When the dignitaries realized they had missed their target, they started accusing her and said she had bewitched the folk. But our folk, and the good Greeks, asserted everywhere that it was slander. Once they came and asked, "So if you are not a sorceress, then what is the purpose of the eggs you always have with you?" Minerva answered, "These eggs are the symbol of Freya's counsels, in which our future, and that of all humankind, lies concealed. Time must hatch them, and we must protect them from being damaged." The priests replied, "Well said, but what is that hound at your right-hand side for?" Helena answered, "Does not the shepherd have a sheepdog to keep his herd together? Just like the dog serves the shepherd, I am in Freya's service. I must watch over her flock." "That makes sense indeed," said the priest. "But tell us, what is the meaning of the night owl that is always sitting on your head? Might that light-shunning animal be the sign of your clairvoyance?" "No," Helena answered. "He helps me remember that a certain kind of people is wandering the earth, also living in temples and holes, gnawing in the dark, but not like him helping to rid us of mice and other plagues, but rather to invent tricks to rob other people of their knowledge, so they can more easily seize and enslave them and suck their blood like leeches." Once, when the plague had come to the land, they came with a crowd of people and said, "We are all making offerings to the gods, so that they might ward off the plague. Will you not help calm their wrath? Or did you bring the plague over the land with your arts?" "No," Minerva said. "Since I do not know any gods that do evil, I cannot ask them to be nicer. I know only one God, that is Ralda's spirit. And because God means good, he also does no evil." "Where does evil come from, then?" the priests asked. "All evil comes from yourselves and from the stupidity of the people that walk into your trap. So if your supreme being is all that good, then why does he not avert evil?" the priests asked. Helena answered, "Freya has put us on the path, and the carrier, that is time, must do the rest. For all disasters, counsel and help can be found, but Ralda wants us to search ourselves, so we shall become strong and wise. If we refuse, he lets us squeeze out our own tumors, so we shall experience the results of wise and foolish deeds." A prince replied, "I would imagine it better to simply ward off disaster." "Of course," Helena answered, "because then people would remain like tame sheep. You and the priests want to protect, but also to shear and slaughter them. But that is not what our supreme being wants. He wants us to help each other, but also that all be free and become wise. Because we want that too, our folk elects our leaders, reeves, counselors, and all chieftains and masters from the wisest of the good people. So all will do their best to become wise and good. This way, we will know and teach the folks at the same time that only being wise and acting wisely leads to glory." "That is quite a statement," the priest said. "But if you imply that the plague is a result of our ignorance, then would Helena be so good as to live up to her proud name and enlighten us?" "Yes," Helena said. "Crows and other birds only feed on foul carrion, whereas the plague not only likes foul carrion, but also foul ethics, customs, and addictions. If you want the plague to leave for good, you must overcome the addictions, and all must become pure, inside and out." "We want to believe your counsel is good," said the priests, "but tell us, how are we supposed to improve all the people under our rule?" Then Helena rose from her seat and said, "The sparrows follow the sower, the folks their good leaders. Therefore you must begin by purifying yourselves, so that you may look within and without turning red from shame before your own conscience. Now, instead of purifying the people, you have invented foul feasts where they drink so excessively that they end up rooting in the mud like pigs, ready to satisfy your vile lusts." The people began to yell and scold, so that she did not dare to engage in any further debate. One might have expected that they would have mobilized people everywhere to expel us altogether from the land. No, instead of accusing her, they went everywhere, even to the near Greeklands, up to the Alps, declaring that it had pleased the most supreme being to send his wise daughter Minerva, nicknamed Nihelena, among the people, on a cloud from the sea, to give them good counsel, and that all who would hear her should become rich and happy, and eventually should rule the whole kingdom of the earth. They erected statues of her on their altars, or sold them to the simple people. They announced counsels everywhere that she had never given, and related miracles that she had never performed. They cunningly made themselves masters of our laws and customs, and they managed to explain and distort them all through misinterpretations. They also placed maidens under their care, pretending these were under the care of Vesta, our first honorable mother, to watch over the divine light. However, they had lit that light themselves, and instead of properly educating these maidens before sending them among the people to nurse the sick and teach the children, they kept them ignorant and dimmed their light, and did not allow them to come outside. They were also used as counselors, but that counsel only appeared to come from their own lips, as in reality their lips were nothing but the mouthpiece through which the priests promulgated their own desires." End quote. A defining characteristic of these people may be this anti-corruption and anti-parasitic instinct, which again seems to lie at the heart of the core of the Indo-European tradition. The Vedas, the Avesta, the laws of Manu, the Scythian or Germanic or Saxon law codes all stress these themes. In the fascinating general laws section of the Oera book, we hear, quote, "Those who come to the market are strictly forbidden to commit usury. If any who do should come, the maidens are obliged to make them known throughout the whole land, so that they will never be chosen for any office, for such folk have vulture-like hearts. To accumulate wealth, they would betray all, the folk, the mother, their relatives, and ultimately themselves." End quote. This seems to be the work of a people with extremely high standards with regard to justice and noble virtue, who appear to be shadowed across time and space by a fraudulent and corrupt priestly class and their subverted princes, representing a polar opposite culture, who seek gains in power and influence by any means necessary, and aggressively degrade nations and peoples to create fertile ground for these gains, one of the many parallels with our own age. And these extremely high standards are exactly what you would expect from a population acting as the central pillar at the head of a confederacy of kindred peoples. A constant vigilance and wariness, extreme discipline, and a hardline devotion to remaining pure and upright, and retaining the most important lessons of old at the forefront of their consciousness. A legitimate seed people, whose branches might stretch out in all directions over time, would need to be exactly this, a strong and sturdy trunk, acting as a powerful foundation. And speaking of seed people, these were certainly a Germanic people, but as to their connections with those hailing from the nation of Germany itself, there are a few curious passages that seem to indicate they called these people the Gerdmen, from the root gird or girt, and they're spoken of more than once as close kin, not merely in a familial and genetic context. Quote, "The Gerdmen I can readily pass by. I did not deal much with them, but as far as I have seen, they have retained our language and customs the most. I cannot say that of the others." End quote. This seems to indicate that other related peoples had begun to stray significantly, perhaps at the hands of those insatiable wolves in sheep's clothing mentioned a moment ago. The Gertman-German connection, especially in the context of India and Alexander the Great, is made all the more intriguing by a DNA study in 2014 by Hellenthal, which found that the swiftly disappearing Kalash people still living around modern Pakistan, who claimed to be descended from the soldiers of Alexander the Great, showed, quote, "input from modern-day Germany and Austria between 990 and 210 BC," end quote. Intriguing hints as to the potential genetic background of Alexander and his armies. A translated fragment of the Chronicles of the Saxons reads, quote, I find written that the Saxons have come from the army of Alexander the Great. Some suggest that they descended from the Britannic people, others from the Danes. However all that may be, it has its value. I find in the history of Alexander the Great, though, that after his death, his army split and spread all over the world, so the Saxons may have wandered about for a long time, and fought sea battles against the Roman Emperor Valentino, until part of them arrived in Prussia, and another part here in this country which is now called Saxony, and thus rooted and multiplied." End quote. And on a related note, a strong connection has been noted between German folk tales and stories in the OLB. So before we conclude this video and move into part 2, a quick summary. History is not only written by the victors, but most often by empires, specifically those with a motive to create a certain framework of understanding to aid in their aims of control or influence. What if a large and sprawling confederacy of peoples existed that wasn't just averse to writing replacing oral transmission of ideas, but also very much anti-empire, philosophically and ideologically, for whom the prospect of bringing foreign peoples under their rule was an extreme net negative, and slavery, for the purpose of material gain, was viewed as a sin against nature and God? Might such a people see their history poorly told, if at all, and often only through the eyes of their cousins existing on their periphery, such as the Greeks or Romans or Byzantines? This seems to be the case for the Scythians, the Goths, and perhaps Phrygian peoples, who collectively do seem to have been a seed population, whose relatives and expatriates appear to play key roles in nearly every pivotal event in history. And we've only just begun to scratch the surface here. In the next video, or perhaps 2 videos, we'll discuss the genetic picture and these seed people's strong connection to what academics have labeled the Yamnaya population group, the connection to Ulysses and the Odyssey, J.R.R. Tolkien's profound interest in the Phrygians and the related book he was working on as of his death, the mystery landmass that is now underwater that is speculated to have once been the central hub of activity in Europe, and much more. Until then,